At 1 a.m., my sister dragged me out of bed and threw me into the yard, screaming that I wasn't real family. My parents watched from the window and did nothing. I crawled back inside, and what happened next made the entire neighborhood call the police. I, 23M, woke up to hands grabbing my ankles. Before I could process what was happening, I was being dragged across the carpet of my childhood bedroom, my head bouncing against the floor. My sister was screaming something I couldn't make out through the fog of sleep and confusion. Then I felt the cold night air hit my skin as she threw open the back door and literally hurled me down the 3 concrete steps into the yard. I landed hard on my shoulder, the impact knocking the wind out of me. That's when her words finally registered. She was standing in the doorway, backlit by the kitchen light, screaming that I wasn't real family, that I never was, that I needed to leave and never come back. I looked past her into the house and saw them. My parents, standing at the kitchen window, just watching. Mom had her hand over her mouth, but she wasn't moving. Dad had his arms crossed. Neither of them was coming to help. I tried to stand, but my shoulder screamed in protest. I asked her what she was talking about, but she just kept yelling the same things over and over. Not real family. Never belonged here. Should have told me years ago. Then she slammed the door and locked it. I sat there in the grass in my boxers and t-shirt, trying to understand what just happened. It was March and the temperature had dropped into the 40s. I could see my parents still standing at the window. I pulled myself up and limped to the back door, banging on it. I called out to them, asked them to let me in, to explain what was happening. Nothing. Just silence and the curtain finally being drawn. That's when something inside me shifted. The confusion gave way to a cold clarity. If they wanted me out, I'd get out. But not before I understood why. I went around to the front door and tried it. Locked. I checked my old bedroom window. Locked. Every entry point was secured. They'd planned this. Whatever this was, it wasn't a spontaneous breakdown. This was calculated. I noticed my neighbor's garage light was on. Old man across the street was an insomniac who worked on his car at odd hours. I walked over, still in my underwear, and explained I'd been locked out. He gave me a strange look, but let me borrow his phone. I called my best friend, who lived 20 minutes away. While I waited, the neighbor brought me an old jacket and some coffee. He didn't ask questions, which I appreciated. During those 20 minutes of waiting, I did something I should have done years ago. I thought about all the small inconsistencies in my life. How I looked nothing like either parent or my sister. How I was treated differently, not obviously enough to call it abuse, but enough that I always felt like I was on the outside. How my sister always got the better room, the newer car, the college fund while I was told to take out loans. How family photos from before I was 5 were basically non-existent. My friend arrived, and I went back to his place. The next morning, I called my parents. Mom answered. She sounded tired, but not surprised. I asked her what happened last night, and she went quiet for a long moment. Then she told me to come by the house at noon when my sister would be at work. She said there were things I needed to know. I showed up at 11:45. Dad answered the door this time. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I just never really looked at him before. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast every day for 18 years before moving into the garage apartment they'd converted for me 2 years ago. Mom started talking. She told me I was adopted. That part didn't shock me as much as it should have. What shocked me was the rest of the story. My biological mother had been Mom's younger sister. She'd gotten pregnant at 17, and the family decided it would be better if Mom and Dad raised me as their own. My biological mother had agreed, signed away her rights, and moved across the country. She died in a car accident when I was 3. I asked why they never told me. Dad said they'd planned to but never found the right time. Then years passed, and it became easier to just keep the secret. My sister had found out 6 months ago when she was going through old documents in the attic, looking for her birth certificate for a passport application. She'd found mine. She'd seen the original one with my biological mother's name and the amended one with my adoptive parents' names. I asked why she reacted the way she did. Mom's face crumpled. She admitted they'd been putting money aside for my sister's wedding. A lot of money. Nearly $60,000. My sister had apparently confronted them about my adoption and demanded to know if I was entitled to any inheritance or family money. She'd convinced herself that I wasn't really family and shouldn't get anything. She'd been pressuring them for weeks to tell me the truth and make me leave. The fight last night had started because Dad had refused to cut me out of the will. My sister had apparently lost it, and decided to take matters into her own hands. They tried to stop her, Mom claimed, but by the time they got downstairs I was already outside and my sister had locked the door. They didn't know what to do, so they just stood there. I sat there processing this. Then I asked the question that mattered most. I asked if they loved me. Mom started crying and said of course they did. I asked if they thought of me as their son. Dad nodded. I asked why they let me sit outside in the cold. Why they let my sister throw me out of my own home. Why they didn't open the door. Neither of them had an answer for that. I told them I needed time to think. I went back to my friend's place and spent the next 3 days figuring out my next move. My shoulder was bruised badly, and I had scrapes on my legs from being dragged across the carpet. I took photos of everything. Then I did something that surprised even me. I called a lawyer. The lawyer told me I had a case for assault against my sister and potentially a case for emotional distress against my parents. But he also told me something interesting. As an adopted child with a legal adoption decree, I had the exact same rights as any biological child. My sister's attempts to disinherit me were legally meaningless unless my parents chose to write me out of their will, which they could do but hadn't done. Armed with this information, I made a decision. I wasn't going to slink away quietly. I wasn't going to let my sister's cruelty define my relationship with my family. And I wasn't going to let my parents' cowardice go unaddressed. I filed a police report against my sister for assault. I moved my belongings out of the garage apartment and into a proper apartment of my own. I paid for it with money I'd been saving for the past 2 years. Then I sent a formal letter to my parents outlining everything that had happened and making my position clear. I loved them. I considered them my parents. But until they were willing to stand up for me the way parents should stand up for their children, I needed distance. My sister was arrested 3 days later. The charges were misdemeanor assault. She called me from the police station, screaming that I was ruining her life, that I was vindictive, that I was proving I wasn't really family by doing this. I hung up on her. Mom called me crying, begging me to drop the charges. She said my sister was just confused and hurt and didn't mean it. I asked Mom if she thought I meant it when I pressed charges. She went quiet. I told her I absolutely meant it. I told her that my sister had physically assaulted me and thrown me out of my home at 1 a.m, and that Mom and Dad had watched it happen. I told her that being confused and hurt didn't give someone the right to commit assault. She hung up on me. Dad called next. He didn't ask me to drop the charges. Instead, he apologized. He said he'd failed me as a father by not protecting me that night. He said he'd been paralyzed by shock and fear of making things worse. But that was no excuse. He said he understood if I never forgave him. But he wanted me to know that he loved me and that I was his son in every way that mattered. It was the first time I'd ever heard him say he loved me. I told him I appreciated the apology, but that I needed time. He said he understood. Then he told me something that changed everything. He said he'd rewritten the will. My sister was still in it, but her inheritance was now conditional on her completing anger management therapy and issuing me a formal written apology. If she didn't do both within 1 year, her share would be split between me and several charities. The preliminary hearing for my sister's assault case was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Word had spread through the family by then. Aunts and uncles and cousins I barely knew started coming out of the woodwork. Some supported me. Some thought I was being too harsh. Some thought the whole thing was a private family matter that shouldn't involve the police. My sister's fiancé broke up with her. Apparently, he'd witnessed some of her anger issues before, but this was the final straw. He told her he couldn't marry someone who was capable of that kind of violence. She blamed me for that too. The day before the hearing, I got a letter in the mail. It was from my biological mother's parents. My biological grandparents. They'd somehow heard about what happened and wanted to meet me. They lived 3 states away, but were willing to drive out. They included photos of my biological mother. I looked exactly like her. I called them and we talked for 2 hours. They told me stories about my mother, about how much she'd loved me even though she knew she couldn't raise me, about how she'd made Mom and Dad promise to tell me the truth when I was old enough. They told me they'd wanted to be part of my life, but Mom and Dad had cut them off after my biological mother died, claiming it would be too confusing for me. More secrets, more lies, more people who should have protected me but chose the easier path instead. I invited them to the hearing. I wanted my sister to see that I had family who actually cared about me. Real family. The kind that shows up. The hearing was brief. My sister's lawyer argued for a plea deal. My lawyer pushed back. Eventually, they settled on a deal where my sister would plead guilty to a reduced charge, pay a fine, complete anger management classes, and stay away from me for a minimum of 1 year. No jail time. I agreed to it because I didn't want to drag this out forever, but I made sure the guilty plea and protective order were part of the public record. Mom and Dad showed up to the hearing. They sat in the back. My biological grandparents sat with me in the front row. After it was over, Mom tried to approach me, but my grandmother stepped between us. She told Mom that she'd failed her sister's child and that she should be ashamed. Mom started crying again. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Update 1. It's been 4 months since the hearing. Life has settled into a strange new normal. I've been meeting regularly with my biological grandparents. They've filled in so many gaps in my history, shown me photos, told me stories. I finally feel like I know where I came from. My relationship with my adoptive parents is complicated. Dad and I meet for breakfast once a week. We don't talk about my sister or that night. We talk about work, about sports, about nothing important. It's comfortable but distant. Mom sends me text messages every few days. I respond politely but briefly. She wants more, but I'm not ready to give it. My sister completed her anger management classes. Her lawyer sent me a letter informing me of this and requesting that I accept her apology so she could fulfill the terms of Dad's will. The apology came a week later. It was clearly written by a lawyer. It was formal and sterile and contained no actual acknowledgement of what she'd done wrong. Just vague language about regrettable incidents and misunderstandings. I wrote back declining to accept it. I told her that when she was ready to write a real apology in her own words, explaining what she did and why it was wrong, I'd consider it. I haven't heard back. Last week, something happened that made everything feel worth it. I got a call from my biological grandmother. She told me that my biological mother had kept a journal that she'd been writing for me, entries she planned to give me when I turned 18. My biological grandparents had kept it all these years, not knowing if they'd ever be able to give it to me. I drove out to see them, and they gave me a box. Inside was the journal, some of my mother's belongings, and a letter she'd written to me the week before she died. In it, she told me she loved me. She told me she hoped I'd have a good life with my aunt and uncle. She told me she hoped they'd tell me the truth and let me know her parents. She told me that giving me up was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but that she believed it was right. Reading her words, I realized something. The people who owed me the most had given me the least. But the people I'd never known existed had been ready to love me the entire time. Update 2. 6 months after the hearing, I got a call from Dad. Mom had been diagnosed with breast cancer. Stage 2. Treatable, but serious. He asked if I'd come visit her in the hospital. I said I would. When I got there, she looked small in the hospital bed. Fragile. Nothing like the woman who'd raised me. We talked for a while about her treatment, her prognosis. Then she asked me if I hated her. I told her I didn't hate her. I told her I was disappointed in her. I told her that she'd made choices that prioritized her own comfort over my right to know who I was, and that those choices had consequences. She started crying again. She seemed to cry a lot these days. She told me she'd been a coward. She said she'd convinced herself that not telling me was protecting me, but really she was just protecting herself from an uncomfortable conversation. She said watching my sister throw me out and not doing anything was the biggest regret of her life. She said she played that moment over and over in her head and wished she could go back and change it. I told her I wished that too. But I also told her that I was building a life without her and Dad at the center of it, and I was okay with that. I told her I hoped she beat the cancer and had many good years ahead of her. I told her I'd check in on her progress. But I also told her that the relationship we'd had was gone, and I didn't know if we'd ever get it back. She nodded. She said she understood. Then she asked if she could hug me. I let her. It felt like hugging a stranger. My sister showed up while I was leaving the hospital. We made eye contact across the parking lot. She looked different. Tired. Older. She started walking toward me, and I reminded her about the protective order. She stopped. She stood there for a moment, then asked if we could talk. I told her the protective order said no. She asked when it expired. I told her 8 more months. She nodded and walked into the hospital. I drove away and didn't look back. Update 3. It's been a full year now. Mom finished her cancer treatment and is in remission. Dad and I still have our weekly breakfasts. Mom and I exchange texts. My sister's protective order expired last month. 3 days after it expired, I got a letter from her. Not a lawyer's letter this time. A real one. Handwritten. 8 pages long. She told me everything. about how she'd always felt like she had to compete for our parents' attention, about how finding out I was adopted had made her feel like her entire childhood had been a lie, about how she'd convinced herself that if I wasn't real family, then all the times our parents had praised me or spent time with me somehow didn't count, about how the wedding fund had become a symbol of everything she felt she deserved for being the biological child. She wrote about that night. She said she'd been drinking. Not drunk, but enough to lower her inhibitions. She said she'd been fighting with our parents about the will, and something inside her had snapped. She said she wanted to hurt me the way she felt hurt. She said dragging me outside and throwing me into the yard was the worst thing she'd ever done, and that she thought about it every single day. She wrote that she'd lost her fiancé, several friends, and the respect of most of our extended family. She wrote that she'd had to move to a different city because everywhere she went, people knew what she'd done. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know that she was genuinely sorry and that if she could take it back, she would. At the end of the letter, she wrote that she understood if I never wanted to see her again. But if I ever changed my mind, she'd be waiting. I sat with that letter for a week. Then I wrote back. I told her I appreciated the honesty. I told her that what she did was unforgivable in the moment, but that people can grow and change. I told her I wasn't ready to have her in my life, but that maybe someday I would be. I told her that real family doesn't come from blood or legal documents. It comes from showing up when it matters. And she hadn't shown up when it mattered. But I also told her that the fact that she wrote that letter meant something. It meant she was capable of self-reflection and growth. And maybe that was enough for now. I mailed the letter and felt something lift off my chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Not reconciliation. But closure. The ability to move forward without the weight of unresolved anger. My biological grandparents are planning to visit next month. We're going to visit my biological mother's grave together. I'm nervous about it, but also ready. Ready to say goodbye to someone I never got to know, but who gave me life. Dad asked me last week if I thought things would ever go back to the way they were. I told him no. I told him we can't go back because the people we were don't exist anymore. But maybe we could build something new. Something more honest. Something based on choice rather than obligation. He said he'd like that. Mom asked me the same question. I gave her the same answer. She cried again, but this time I think they were different tears. Not tears of guilt or sadness. Tears of relief. Like maybe she'd been holding her breath for a year and could finally exhale. I don't know what the future holds for any of us. I don't know if my sister and I will ever have a real relationship. I don't know if my parents and I will ever fully heal the wounds of that night. But I know I'm not the same person who got dragged out of bed at 1 a.m. That person was confused and hurt and desperate for approval. The person I am now knows his worth, knows his history, knows that family is something you build, not something you're born into, and knows that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you, even if they're the ones who raised you. I'm building a life on my own terms now, and that's enough.